Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 22nd Tuesday evening webinar. I am Chrissi Kelly from AbScent. Thank you very much for joining us. We are this evening going to be talking a little bit more about the research that I'm doing with my two colleagues here that you see on the screen, Dr. Jane Parker from the University of Reading and Simon Gane, ENT at the Royal National ENT and Eastman Dental Hospital. I hope I've got that right this time.
You got it right.
Eventually, and I would get it.
Yeah, it's only our fault for changing it.
We also have with us tonight Aidan Kirkwood. Thank you. It's very nice to see you, Aidan. I see you looking in good form. Now, for those of us, well, we were here, of course, but for those of you who were not here 2 weeks ago, I thought I would start by doing a brief recap of what we discussed last weekend. This is about our really important research into parosmia. We are really uncovering some very interesting things. And these are very, very exciting times for anyone with an interest in parosmia. And of course, if you are someone who is suffering from parosmia, I'm sure this is also of great interest to you. So for those of you who don't know, the research at Reading is looking at how people who have parosmia are responding to the smell of coffee. So wake up and smell coffee, not in a good way. So I'm going to just turn it over to Jane right now. And Jane, tell us, if you can, in a couple of minutes, what the research is, what we're finding out, and what we hope to find out maybe next.
Okay, thanks, Chrissi. Well, when I first met Chrissi, and she mentioned that coffee was quite a common problem, as a flavour chemist, I kind of had a hunch that there were some really potent compounds in the coffee that might be causing these distortions. And we got together, made a plan, and we started inviting some volunteers into the lab, where I've got an instrument that can separate out all the hundreds of different aroma compounds that are in coffee, so that if you're sitting at the end of the instrument, you get exposed to these compounds one at a time. And by doing that, I could work out which compounds you as parosmics were detecting and which ones you were detecting as distorted and unpleasant. And from that, we discovered that there were you could smell some that were both normal and some that were triggered distortions. And the ones that triggered distortions fell into about 4 different groups. We could categorize them based on their chemistry, which is quite interesting. So there were a couple of sulfur groups, which is what we had proposed might be the thing that's doing it for you. And we also found a couple of nitrogen.
Is it worth explaining what a group is? Is it worth explaining what a group is?
Okay, well.
For those of us non-chemists here.
Okay. Chemicals or aroma chemicals that are fairly similar. So one group was all based on sulfur, and their chemical structure was similar. And one group was based on a nitrogen ring. So they had the basic nitrogen ring and then different attachments to that ring. So they had similar chemical structures, similar smells, and similarly, they were really potent aroma compounds. They were all really potent aroma compounds. So they were all compounds that you could detect in minuscule amounts in a swimming pool, for example. You know, a couple of drops in, or less than a drop in a swimming pool, and the whole swimming pool would smell of coffee. So they're that potent. And the interesting thing was that we had these 4 groups, and some people picked up groups 1 and 2, and other people picked up all 4 groups, and some people just picked up group 3. And when we moved on to onions and garlic, there was another group. And when we moved on to cucumber and watermelons, there was another group. So there are groups of compounds that are causing these distortions. And I think one of the intriguing things is why it's these compounds and why not the others. So that's one of our big questions at the moment. And it's, well, we're starting to probe into the mechanisms and why or how these distortions might be happening. And I think that's probably where Simon comes in to talk about.
Yes, Simon.
Where we've got to.
So I think just to go back into my rather rude interruption just then, we use groups in two ways. So the first is grouping all the compounds together. But if you look at what are called structural relations, what is often very important are the little collections of a couple of atoms stuck on in various ways to these chemicals, and those are also referred to as groups. So they'll have a little bit of sulfur with a couple of hydrogens around them, and that makes all the difference in their smelliness. And so Jane pulled out of this data the fact that if a group of these, need to stop using the word group, a number of these molecules shared similar chemical characteristics in their shape and in the type of atoms that they contained. They related not only in the fact that they had very low threshold and they triggered at parosmia, but also that they looked very similar, that they were sort of built of the same building blocks. And that's really important, because that gives us a clue into what's going on, because we know that olfactory receptors, so these rather complicated molecular protein machines that are living on the cell surface of the nerves, that are waiting to bind to the olfactorant, to the smelly molecule, they can recognize one of a number of different chemicals, and they tend to look for these kind of groups. So it's pointing us all towards the fact that this is something to do with the receptor. And because there's a weird thing about the sense of smell, is that when a olfactory sensory neuron, the nerve that's going to do the sensing of smell, starts off, it picks one of about 350 to 400 different receptors. We think it random. It's probably not quite random, but it picks one and it chooses. It says, okay, I'm going to be the sulfur. Let's say it's not that, but a sulfur receptor. So one we have funny naming for them, but an OR5A1 is a classical example, and it only expresses that receptor on its cell surface. So any time that receptor activates, so it binds to a molecule and activates, that then switches on the nerve, and that then sends a signal up into the brain to say, I have detected this molecule, or this one of this group of molecules. And so this is a really strong clue that this is not a random process. This is not just, the nerves are all knocked out and they grow wildly back, and that's what's giving you the parosmia. There's something else that means it's one of only a certain number of receptors, most probably, that is being picked up, and that are regenerating or causing the parosmia. And that's really interesting, because number one, it's interesting. Well, maybe it's only interesting to me, but it's interesting. We understand this. Number two, receptors have all over in the body. Understanding how these receptors work is how most of our drugs work. But they have what are called agonists, things that switch them on, and antagonists, things that switch them off, that block the receptor. So potentially, and I'm not saying this is definitely the case, because our knowledge of what are the agonists and antagonists of these various human olfactory receptors is still pretty poor, but potentially you could be finding blockers for these receptors. So you could say, sniff something that stops that receptor, doesn't switch it on, but it stops it being switched on by something else, and mute the parosmic effect in some way. And there are various others. What we still are looking at is why this happens, why these are the receptors that regenerate first, or receptor neurons that regenerate first, and why it is that only having these receptors gives us this classical parosmia. So it's not just, you can imagine if only, you're expecting your smell of coffee switches on 5 receptors, they all get knocked out. One regrows, and it's the one that's really good at smelling these chemicals that we found. That one regrows. You can imagine, well, why is it not just, I just can't smell the rest of the bits of coffee. I can smell that it's part of coffee, but not the whole smell of coffee. We still have to explain why it's unpleasant, why it comes on later, why it's not just a diminution of the sense of smell, but it's another dimension entirely. And that's where we're going with this at the moment.
So that brings me neatly to the first topic that I'd like to bring up this evening. And I know, and by the way, anybody who has questions at any point, do please put them into the Q&A bar. We will be answering them if they're topical, sort of as we go through, and then we'll have some time at the end, hopefully, to answer the other questions that pop up during the evening. But I'd like to explore this idea of disgust. This is something that over and over we see as being a real issue. I know that there are certain parts of the brain that are functioning when we experience disgust. Simon, what do you have to say about that subject?
I mean, this is to me fascinating, and Chrissi, I've quizzed you about this before, and I quiz almost all my patients who have parosmia, because that very often people use words like sewage or burnt or foul, or what are some others? Basically, but if you ask them, well, does it actually smell like raw sewage, or rotting garbage is the other one? They say, no, not really. It's a smell I've never smelled before, but it is disgusting. And I think that's what they're driving at by using this descriptor, that it evokes a visceral response of disgust. And disgust is one of the primary emotions of the brain of humans, mediated by, well, we talked about this, Chrissi, the insula and hypothalamus. And it's a very protective mechanism. I mean, you want to be disgusted by things that are dangerous to you. So you want to. This is why we almost universally find the smell of rotten meat or a fish or vegetables to be disgusting. I mean, deep down disgusting. It's not something you can really overcome without a lot of practice, and that's sort of innate. It's built into most people's sensorium that those kind of things are going to be something that you should avoid, and you can learn this kind of thing as well. So my brother, for instance, refuses to eat the red cinnamon fireball gobstoppers, because he once had a packet of those and then ate about 10 roast potatoes, vomited it all up afterwards, and now the smell of the cinnamon to him is associated with vomiting and disgust. And how I don't know why he doesn't mind roast potatoes anymore, but cinnamon fireballs are revolting to him. So it's certainly possible to learn these things. And for instance, there's evidence that children don't find feces disgusting. That's a learned association as well. So yeah, I agree with you that that link we're still missing. Why does this change elicit this very powerful emotion? And it's not novelty. We smell new things all the time, so it can't be that. It's not the isolation. So we know that when the people who don't have parosmia smelling Jane's GC, they don't report that these things are disgusting in the same way, do they, Jane? Yeah.
No, keep trying.
My one also is not.
That's it. No, they don't. There we go. No, they don't. No, sometimes they're a bit strong, and sometimes they're a bit potent and a bit unusual, but they don't usually smell it's horrible. They don't describe it as horrible. Some of the key components of coffee, they say, oh, that's roasty, toasty coffee, and the worst it gets is burnt. Yeah.
I mean, we've asked this question in the Facebook group. I said, I put up a discussion topic in the Parosmia group and said, do you after we had determined what kind of adjectives people use to describe smells that are really triggering for them, I then said, do you use these words because they are really descriptive of what you're experiencing, or are you using them as shorthand for the level of disgust you're feeling? And almost everyone said it's shorthand for something just to give the listener a better idea of just how bad it is for them. I mean, we are already struggling to describe our experience to people who don't know what living with smell loss is like. So when you have to conjure up some kind of yardstick for a listener who has no idea to help them understand just how bad it is, then of course you reach for those words that are, you know, would be most disgusting for a person with a normal sense of smell.
And that's quite interesting. I mean, I would like to try and make a parosmic scent for normosmic people. I mean, yeah, we don't really like the word normal, but people who have an unaffected sense of smell. But I suspect that we won't be able to, for the reasons that we've described. So that means that it's got to be something to do with the probable disordered architecture of either the olfactory epithelium, so the bit in the nose that's where these nerves live, or the bit that they're all going to, the bulb just above the cribriform plate, so within the skull, just between the eyes, a little bit back. And that we need to. That still is going to be an interesting way of going forward. And why that? Why does this suddenly cause disgust? I think that's still quite interesting to find out.
I'd like. Sorry, Jane, go ahead.
Well, I kind of like to see it as two pathways that might have gone wrong, and there's the first pathway, which is the signal from the is actually the signal that's generated, and that could be distorted. And then there's how the brain interprets it. So there's the two different things that may cause the problem. And I think we're showing that it's probably both, because we've shown that the distortions are triggered by certain chemicals. So we know that the signals that the brain's receiving are going to be different. But also to explain the disgust, the brain's got to be integrating them wrong as well. So I kind of see the two pathways. Yeah. And I think what we've shown is that it's both that are involved in parosmia. Interestingly, today I spoke to somebody who had distortions, but he said they weren't disgusting at all. He just said it smelled like coffee, there were just a few chemicals poking out there. It was kind of coffee, but not complete coffee. And he's the first person I've talked to like this who seems to have, all right, something's wrong with the first pathway, but actually the second pathway, the brain in his case isn't changing the hedonics. So for him, there was no disgust. So that's quite interesting.
And it's been reported. Sorry. It's been reported in the literature that about the estimate is that sticks in my brain is 2%. So a little sort of a part of the literature says that very occasionally people will find this actually either just no change in the perception of disgust, or slightly positive. It actually is a pleasant smell. To me, that almost that to me, I think I wonder whether that's actually parosmia. And this is the reason that I say that, because we know that your sense of smell can just vary on the good bad dimension. So you can have a normal sense of smell measured by whatever test you want, and no sense of smell. And in the middle down the end, we have anosmia and hyposmia. And those people would report the same thing, that coffee doesn't smell like it did, but they can still smell some things with chemicals poking out, as you say. So what distinguishes the person you talked to today from a person who's on the hyposmia scale with no reported parosmia? And that's why I think it may be that there is actually a gradient of parosmia as well, and so you could have a normal sense of smell and abnormal sense of smell. in terms of detection, but then you can have also this gradient of parosmia as well, and they're orthogonal to each other.
Definitely you can, because we've had panelists come through who've only found 1 or 2 triggers, and everything else is normal. And these triggers can be intense or not intense. I've seen them both. Or we could have people coming through that find everything they smell is a trigger. So they've obviously got high amount of parosmia. It's not always intense, but it's often intense. So there's definitely different amounts of parosmia, if you like. Yeah. Degrees of parosmia.
Simon, you just used this word orthogonal, which is one that I didn't know this year, last year this time. And I think it might be worth just describing a little bit about what you mean by that. So you were talking about sort of a sliding scale of no smell to healthy smell. And then there's this other sliding scale of parosmia, which we might visualize being sort of like that.
Y-axis.
Is that correct?
So so they're not related. I mean, yes. So exactly. So they're not related to each other or very strongly correlated with each other. So you can have good smell, bad or no smell, and anywhere along that one, and then you can have no parosmia or lots of parosmia, and you can move anywhere on that. So you can imagine a sort of a two-dimensional field where you can.
I sort of felt like that might be happening because Simon froze there for a moment.
Okay. Do you want some questions while we wait for Simon?
Yeah, let's do a question, because I did see a really interesting one there from Julie, which I'd like to talk about, because this is Julie. You're not the first person to mention this. And Julie says that when she adds cinnamon to her regular coffee, the rancid smell of coffee disappears, and I can drink the coffee, but the overwhelming taste is just cinnamon. So I think that is, we know that cinnamon is really good at distracting the sense of smell away from things that are unpleasant. So I like to think of cinnamon as a bit like a bouncer who is standing at the gateway and says, nope, that bad smell, no, the cinnamon sort of then takes over. And so if any of you in the audience have that problem, I would suggest that you give that a try. Cinnamon lozenges and sort of cough drops and things like that, or the chewing gum as well, might be quite beneficial for you.
Even the toothpaste for people who have the, sorry, Jim. Yes, toothpaste as well. A lot of people are saying that the parosmic toothpaste, so cinnamon toothpaste is supposed to be quite good. I think cinnamon in general.
Yep.
I mean, I was going to suggest in the coffee, you might even have an interaction going on in the coffee cup. I mean, it could be masking, but these aroma compounds react with all sorts of things, and you might find that there's some binding of of some of the coffee compounds to the cinnamon. So it's quite an interesting thing to look at from a chemical point of view. We might do that. That sounds interesting. Yeah.
Could even be some sort of, I don't know, trigeminal in terms of cinnamon. I'm not entirely sure. Hi, Simon, you're back with us.
Yeah, sorry, my computer is now completely collapsed. It won't even switch off, so I'm phoning you on my phone.
Oh, well.
Oh, we're glad still got you here then, Simon. That's good. That's good. Someone's asked here, how is it that after smell loss, there is sometimes a brief period of smelling things normally before parosmia sets in? So what's the sort of timeline, Chrissi, for something like that?
Well, we see a very jumbled timeline that includes a lot of fluctuations. We see sometimes that parosmia is delayed by a couple of months. Well, now it looks like typically it's 2 to 3 months, but sometimes it can be later than that. Other people seem to get it straight away. So I think they're all, all time intervals. And I don't think we have a good enough explanation for that at this time. Simon, do you have anything to add to that? Oh, Simon, he's frozen again. Oh dear. Okay, well, let's hope that he gets his tech sorted out. Right, let's go to a couple more questions.
In terms of mechanisms that cause parosmia after TBI or from those resulting from COVID, again, we're not entirely sure about the mechanisms behind those, but Jane has studied pre and post-COVID, so maybe Jane can say something there.
I'm just trying to turn my phone off. What have I studied?
Oh, sorry. The difference in mechanisms that cause parosmia after TBI from those resulting from COVID. So you've done pre and post-COVID, but you've not done TBI, I believe, have you, for the Redden studies?
We've had one TBI. We've had 10, 15 post-COVID, 15 pre-COVID, and one was TBI. And sorry, I missed the thread there, but the person with TBI found very similar things to be disgusting and distorted. Okay. Interestingly, she found coffee fine, and it was meat that she found disgusting, and she the compounds that were triggers for her were the meaty ones and not the coffee ones. There's a bit of an overlap, but in general, the TBI is similar to the post-viral, and there was no difference at all between pre-COVID and post-COVID. The only difference was age. Oh, we lost Simon again. The only difference between those two groups was age, because the people that tended to have parosmia pre-COVID tended to be in the 50s, 60s, 70s age group, whereas those that were in the post-COVID tended to be a lot younger. They were in the 30s and 40s age group. And I think that's to do with the way COVID pans out, really. And I think the post-COVID people may be recovering more quickly, because I have had some people who've reported that they're back to normal, but we know that that may not be quite the case. But if for them it's back to normal, that's pretty good.
How about you? Oh, sorry.
And also, of course, there are a lot of fluctuations. So people who report that they're back to normal might just be on an uptick on the fluctuations, and then there may yet be more, more.
We haven't followed them, but we have had some people saying, it's difficult to gauge.
But certainly the TBI discussions that I've overheard over the years describe a very similar pattern. Same kinds of triggers, same disgust, the great difficulty eating, having to resort to a nose clip to get through a meal, things like that. So that all seems to be very similar, although of course we still have a lot to learn. So we may yet learn more about TBI and how it's different from post-viral parosmia. Right, okay, what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about something that's come up in our research with the Facebook group that is sort of connected, that we didn't really get a chance to discuss last week, which I think is a really interesting subject. And this is something that in the group we call smell locks, and which we have described in our recent paper based on comments from the Facebook group as perseveration. So Simon, if tech permits,
I'm back.
Will you tell us a little bit about perseveration and other attenuation disorders?
So I think that this should be known as Kelly syndrome.
Oh,
because the first person to describe smell locks, as she called it, was a certain founder of AbScent. To my mind, anyway. I mean, we did a fairly good literature review when we wrote this up. There's one description, sort of passing throwaway comment in one paper talking about smell loss in Alzheimer's, where they talked about smell perseveration and then went on with the rest of the paper. But Chrissi was really the first one to start identifying this as a thing. And without wanting to steal your thunder, Chrissi, we've really sort of come up with a working definition of smell locks or olfactory perseveration. Just to say, perseveration in medicine has a specific meaning. It's not just about persevering, but it's about repetitive behaviors or repetitive movements that are not always under full conscious control. And so the olfactory perseveration or smell lock is usually triggered by cleaning products or quite strong smells like that get stuck in the nose for some reason. And people report the smell of their floor cleaner or they cleaned the toilet, and the smell of the bleach from the toilet gets stuck in their nose, and they can smell it for hours afterwards. And this is really contra to the way the normal sense of smell works. And half of why people don't, I think, take a sense of smell very seriously until they lose it is that habituation is a characteristic of the olfactory system. And you can find molecular and sort of higher level habituation mechanisms all the way through the olfactory system. So from the receptor level up to the bulb and to the brain, we are good at ignoring smell signals when we're used to them. We get our noses get bored with them, and they're really looking for novel smells. That's why, you know, the saying my mother always used to say, the fox never smells his own hole. That's true. You don't really recognize your own smell. And, you know, this teenage boys are famously very bad at this because they don't realize that they habituate. It's a conversation I'm having with my son at the moment. He's not quite teenage yet, but he's going to be there. They don't realize that then just because they can't smell it doesn't mean that everyone else can't smell it, because they get used to it in the same way you get used to your own house, your belongings and things like that. And so what this is a failure of these habituation mechanisms, and we don't know at what level this is happening, or why, and what their relationship is to the other qualitative disorders that we've already talked about, phantosmia and parosmia. And as we've said before, teasing these out is a non-trivial exercise. But as I was saying to Jane, should we consider parosmia in people who say it's altered but it's not disgusting? Should we say phantosmia? Well, if it's triggered by something you can't really smell, then how do you know that that there isn't an odorant there that's triggering? Is it parosmia triggered by something that's in the environment that you can't otherwise detect? So it's very difficult to tease all of these out, but we group them together as these olfactory dysfunctions. And as we've been saying, we think they are related to, but not directly correlated with olfactory function in general, expressed as a sort of linear thing. Of course, it's not linear. It's very complicated, but we like to think of things in simple terms.
But if we go back to perseveration right now, one thing that always strikes me whenever I listen to lectures, if I've been attending courses, when it comes to parosmia, they always sort of attach phantosmia to it in the same sentence, as if the two things are the same. And the two things are definitely not the same. And in thinking about this over the years and in listening to people's conversations, again, in the Facebook group, it became obvious to me that there was something going on that it's just not that clear cut. And what I thought might be happening was that people would be exposed to a smell, as you said, Simon, perhaps a cleaning product, and then they would be experiencing that. It would be repeating on them in the same way that an earworm will get into your head, and you'll hear that song over and over and over again, to the point where eventually 6 or 8 hours later, and you're still smelling this stuff. And now it fills the definition of phantosmia, which is to say, it is the perception of an odor in the absence of something in the environment. And so that's when I thought, okay, I'm going to call it a smell lock, because that sort of seems to be what it is. And then let's see if we can find out any more about that. So Simon, could you explain a little bit, because we've got that, we have smell locks. That's where your nose holds on to it for hours and hours and hours. On the other end of the spectrum, we have got something that is just a fleeting experience, a fleeting whiff. and I know you once called it an olfactory flash. I almost like that term better. Something that you smell once and you think, oh, I can smell that, and then suddenly you can't anymore and it's gone. And to me, these would both be attenuation disorders. So
Exactly.
give us a potted history of attenuation then in relation to this.
Well, so as I said, you can see it on the olfactory sensory nerves. And again, with the caveat that most of this stuff comes from what we know about smell in mice. But nerves, the nerves that bear the receptors, those receptor numbers can be up and down regulated. The mechanism of the transduction of the signal, so the way that switching on of one receptor turns into the switching on of the nerve, has sort of various things that don't let it switch on again too quickly, and that if you activate it rapidly, then that signal is then damped, so it keeps it between sort of in a bearable layer. But probably the way that that most of this habituation is happening is within the olfactory bulb. So the olfactory bulb is quite a complicated structure. Each nerve grows. So remember, I said that each olfactory sensory neuron identifies as one receptor. So it only expresses that receptor, and it cleverly knows to grow to only one of only two paces within the bulb. It can go basically on the right and the left. It can say, I'm the OR5AN1 receptor nerve, and I'm going to grow to this bit in the bulb where we know that all the other OR5AN1 nerves are going to grow. And that means that that basically they all collect their signal in the olfactory bulb in these little structures, little bubbles called glomeruli. And those glomeruli have nerves between them going in all sorts of directions, of long nerves and short nerves. They have little feedback nerves that go back to them. And there are various ways that you can build circuits with this stuff to make sure that a signal is interpreted in the relation to all the other signals that it interprets, and that are coming in at the same time. So you can say, well, you know, if I'm picking up the stimulus from OR5AN1, but I am also picking up this other receptor that's slightly that's weaker at picking up this particular molecule that stimulates both of them, well, then I want to upregulate both of them, so turn them up a bit more so the brain can see them a bit more, so it recognizes that it's probably this molecule that stimulates both and not another molecule that stimulates either one or the other. And that it can be upregulation or it can be downregulation. So you can get feedback and inhibition, it's called, sort of telling the signal that's coming from the glomeruli, okay, calm down. We've had enough of you. You've been going on for too long. We're going to calm down the nerves there, because actually, you're telling us nothing new. We're bored. So all of those things can be built in these layers of nerves within the bulb. So what you can imagine now is if you've wiped out, and this again is just a theory, if you've wiped out all the nerves that are going to the bulb, they've regenerated within the olfactory epithelium, because that's what these nerves do. They're growing back up there. They're innervating these nerves, but they're not innervating all of these glomeruli. And the nerves within the bulb, those patterns, those balanced patterns of interactions of the nerves between them are being thrown out because you're not getting the same strength of signal anymore. So all our habituation, all the way we used to control for calming things down or ramping them up, those things, that's complete, doesn't make any sense anymore, because the strength of signals, the amount of signals and everything else like that is coming in different ways, and therefore doesn't make sense anymore. And that's why you could see these habituation disorders as being part of a pattern of regeneration, but they're regrowing into an old system that takes time to rebalance, if it does at all.
Right.
Can I add some observations to that? Because on a similar vein, one of the tests we do for people that come into the lab is we give them 3 sticks. 2 are the same and 1 is different. So you could have rose and licorice, for example. And we found it, and you're supposed to pick the odd one out. And anybody that doesn't have parosmia so long as you can smell them and they're really obvious, you can pick the odd one out quite easily. So rose and licorice are miles apart. But what we discovered that when we were giving these 3 sticks to the volunteers, if we gave them rose and then gave them rose again, they could smell the first rose, but they couldn't smell the second rose. And then the licorice was different. So they ended up with 3 that were different as far as they were concerned. And that's also something to do with his habituation, because in this case, they've habituated, they've smelt rose, yep, that's fine, don't want to smell it anymore. But it's kind of doesn't regenerate. So when they get a second rose, they still don't want to smell it. And that caused us some, it made it very difficult to do the test properly, or to do the test. We were doing it properly, and the participants, we got some weird results out of it, I suppose we should say, really. And because that's another version of the habituation, where you habituate but don't release again quickly, as quick as normal.
And that's the flashes, the olfactory flashes.
And
it must be very frustrating.
This highlights some shortcomings with the sniffing sticks test, which is obviously the most advanced test that we've got, and it's a good test, but it can't possibly give us any information about all this other stuff that's going on.
Well, I mean, I think it's so, yes, to a certain extent, although the discrimination is a very good way of looking at post-viral olfactory loss. I mean, if people have low discrimination, then that's, to me, an indicator that might be what the pathology is. Obviously, it's in the context of everything else. Sorry.
Oh God, it's gone. What was I going to say? Yes, I reckon that the discrimination test is easier for parosmics because they don't have to identify anything. They've got to pick 2 from 1. So apart from the habituation problem, which is another problem, they can also, it can be absent or present as well, or it can be a trigger or a non-trigger. So actually, there are more ways for a parosmic to distinguish or discriminate between 2 smells than actually for a non-osmic. So there's both sides of the coin there.
Yeah, you have to do it. You have to do it and take both into account. I wonder if there's another way of testing it.
I mean, what I was doing in the lab was counting the number of smells that people got on my instrument, and that correlated very nicely with sniffing stick scores. So it gave a measure of olfactory function overall. It didn't tell me whether people were parosmic or not, because we had parosmic volunteers who were scoring very highly on the olfactory function and smelt a lot of aromas on the machine. But the other thing we measured was the number of triggers, and that is an idea, that gives you an idea of how severe the parosmia is, the number of triggers and possibly the intensity. And that doesn't correlate at all with how good your olfactory function is. So the scores that we got on the sniffing sticks. So there's definitely 2 things there. Don't know how we go on to that.
Right. Okay. So I think time's moving on. I'd like to give about 10 more minutes to the final topic that I wanted to cover tonight, and then we will spend the last 10 minutes looking at some of the questions. I see there are a lot of questions today. We always seem to have a full Q&A bar as we get to the end of the hour. That's the nature of things. So we'll get to as many as we can. It always comes up, people want to know how they can what can they do to make their parosmia not quite so awful. We talk a lot about smell training, both here in these webinars and at AbScent. And incidentally, I will be putting a couple of links in the chat bar, so anyone who's listening today who is not connected with us can find us and get more help on that. But the question invariably being, when it comes to parosmia, is smell training good for that? And what do I do if the parosmia is so bad that I can't bear to smell train? So to add to this, we've had a lot of discussion about whether it's just a good idea to push through when you have a really bad reaction to something, whether that's a food or a smell. Is there any benefit to pushing through? So Jane, would you like to comment at all on the kind of pushing through in terms of the smell of food? And then I'll ask Simon for his comments on smell training.
I think there's a certain logic to trying to push through from a couple of points of view. One, that it might help you to get accustomed to these rather bad smells, and it might stimulate more growth of your olfactory neurons as they're growing. And the other thing that to do with what we've been talking about is once you get over that first whiff, maybe you habituate. A lot of people say that the smell of coffee is really, really bad, but if they can get over that and get to the drink, it's not as bad. And I think that's for two reasons. That firstly, the taste of coffee is never quite what you expect from the smell, but also it may be that you're just you've habituated to the smell and you're just getting a toned down version of the coffee. But also I have to say there are people that just can't power through. They really can't get close, and we know that. So we don't advise everybody, you must power through, because there are people who just say, I can't get close to these smells, they make me vomit. And those are the people that got it really severely and need a bit more time, I think, before you can start to power through.
Yeah. Simon?
So medics like to talk about evidence, and the evidence we have is not great for this. We're obviously working on improving it. I like to throw it back to you, because I think this is yet another, I know I go on a lot about this, but yet another time in which listening to patients actually tells you the answer. This is, and I know that AbScent have developed quite a lot of community derived information and advice on this from fellow sufferers for people with parosmia. I mean, then I can rattle them off, but this is something that's come from your work in the Facebook groups and AbScent in general, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I see that there's a question in somewhere, I don't know, it seems to have disappeared now, is this ever going to go away? And yes, we do know that it goes away. And we also know that smell training is a good thing and hastens your recovery. So putting those two things together, I would say if you can at all smell train, despite the bad parosmia, keep it up and look for things to smell train with that are not disgusting. So the more you do, the better it is. That is there's been some really excellent stuff published in the last year, including that study that was intensive smell training for 2 weeks at an hour a day. That tells me a lot. A couple of minutes twice a day is good if you can do that every day. But if you can do it really intensively, I think you would, I think there's a benefit to that too.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are the sort of standard medical answers, which are you need to make sure that your diet is full of all your macro and micronutrients. So you want to make sure you're getting carbs, you're getting protein, you're getting fats, you're getting your vitamins. And if any of those need support, well, there are specialist drinks and things like that, the high protein drinks that are usually palatable or very bland. Those kind of things. We've got quite a comprehensive list of safe foods on the website. So people who, again, this is community sourced. It's coming from people who know because they've been there. So fresh fruit is generally quite good, and the kind of things that we have identified, roasted, garlicky, oniony, sulfur-containing foods are obviously not. I'm quite interested that most people who are coffee addicts already just seem to power through anyway, because the lure of the caffeine is greater than any disgust they might have be feeling. I mean, certainly, but it does get better, and I firmly believe you can make it better by making your sense of smell better. And there's some underlying logic to that. We think that the lonely neuron hypothesis, so only getting certain of these glomeruli activated, and this distortion pattern coming from that. Well, if you get more neurons regenerating and they grow back to more places, then you will the lonely neuron won't be so lonely anymore, and you may get a sort of general damping down of the input that turns it into parosmia. So, and also smell training. I mean, it's unlikely that people have parosmia without smell loss, so you should be doing smell training anyway, but it's not going to make things worse. A couple of things, we've talked about parosmia friendly smell training kits. We don't know, we say this I think every time, the canonical 4 scents for smell training are more or less an accident. So we don't know that these are the best smells to train with, and I think it's fairly unlikely that they are the best smells to train with. So if you're training with anything that makes you parosmic, don't train with something else that doesn't.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yep. Of course, in this discussion, we haven't even touched the subject of food. That will come up in future webinars. And if any of you who are out there are really struggling to feed yourselves, we have lots of resources. Aidan has just put another webinar from a previous webinar that we had into the chat bar. You might want to take a look at that. Of course, we have all kinds of resources available to you on the website, on our YouTube channel, in the Facebook groups. We have 4 different Facebook groups. There's the original group, the COVID-19 group, the Parosmia group, and also a COVID kids group. And finally, I have just put into the chat bar, you can see it now, a link to our new platform. And the new platform is not at all like Facebook. It's much less noisy, and it's a better place to have conversations. If you are a person with TBI, you don't necessarily need to see all the conversations about COVID-19. So in that respect, it's much more user-friendly. And in this new platform, where you'll see the link there now in the chat bar, we're also offering classes. So we've just completed the smell training masterclass, and we are going to be starting a Parosmia masterclass in a couple of weeks. So if that interests you, do come along and take a look. Right. So I think what we should do now is open up for some questions. And let's see. Oh my goodness, we've got quite a few here. Right. Let's start. Felica, I think that's your question is a little bit long, so I'm afraid, let's see, let me move on to this one.
While you're looking, Chrissi, can I give our standard disclaimer that we cannot comment on individual cases without, because as a medic, I have duty of care to all of those things. So all we can do is give general advice for people in this who want information.
Yeah,
this doesn't replace going to see somebody who can help you.
No, that's right. That's right.
Yes. Simon, someone here says, could you say something about TBI effects? You were AWOL when that came up. What were you saying just as you went off there? Did you go back to that point?
I wasn't here at all for the TBI bits. Were you being interesting without me?
Oh yeah.
Again.
The question, I think the question was, is TBI parosmia the same as post-viral parosmia? And I think as far as we know, probably.
Yeah, but, yeah. I mean, this gets back to the what is it like to be a bat problem. The descriptors are the same. People talk about it in the same way. And you've, Chrissi, talked to a lot of people with TBI. So yeah, as far as anybody else can tell, yes. But since we don't have people who've had both TBI and COVID, It's difficult.
I've got a question here from Lucy, who has developed parosmia post-COVID, and this has coincided with morning sickness.
Oh.
And could there be any link to the hormone changes?
I mean, hormones and smell is always a perennial topic because of these. I mean, the hyperemesis gravidarum often is triggered by smells, but not always. I feel a bit of a fraud talking about morning sickness as being one of the two men on the panel. So maybe.
Well, I've had morning sickness, and I absolutely agree with you, Lucy. The two have something in common. But I mean, obviously not everybody in the parosmia group is expecting a baby. And I don't think there's, again, I don't think there's any reason to believe that the two are, your pregnancy is necessarily making the parosmia worse. I think you just have to wait for things to improve.
Yeah, I mean, we know that in sheep, they have estrogen receptors on the olfactory sensory neurons. And we don't know whether that's true in humans. But the estrogen does modify the sensory response of some of the nerves.
Interesting. Yeah. Many people have described using different ways of trying to train with these parosmic smells. We've discussed this in the previous webinar.
I think the jury's still out on that. You can imagine it going both ways. I think this was Jane, you said this last time. Basically, you could make things worse or you can make things better. I suspect it'll be better. I have a very strong suspicion it'll be better. Again, for those same things, that we're dealing with a very plastic system. It's responsive, it's regenerative, and the nerves in the bulb and in the brain, to a certain extent, are there to change and to interpret new things. So, and the brain tends towards a steady state. So again, you would expect it to get better over time, training with these things. I think that's your experience with coffee, isn't it, Chrissi?
Yes, that is definitely my experience with coffee.
So I think, the question is if we could use that.
Yeah, going on to just a similar question here. Someone's saying that almost, I can't find it, but almost pushing through, they find it after the second or third, it seems to get a bit better. Is that through habituation, or is that just because that's retronasal in that sense, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's habituation, because you'll get Chrissi talks about the first bite being the worst, and just sort of get that down, and that will be retronasal from then on.
Yeah.
And that's obviously lower than. How do you recommend approaching smell training when you can't remember how these items are supposed to smell, Chrissi? There's a lot of mindfulness involved, isn't there?
Yeah, that comes up a lot. There are people who don't seem to be able to conjure up a smell before they open up their smell training jar. I think for those people, I would say that they should just try and be as focused as possible, and just receive whatever smell message comes to them. It might be very faint, it might not be recognizable or be meaningful in any way, but they should just try and focus on whatever that perception is, and sit with it, and try not to devalue it by telling themselves that, this is not the way I expect it to be, that sort of thing. I'm aware that this is a problem for some people, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. I would just continue to try and smell train, and just do that with as much concentration as possible.
What I tell people is even if you don't get those links to the memories back in a primary way. In other words, you know, we all know that smell is very powerful in eliciting emotion and triggering memories, but you can rebuild a new sense of smell. And Jane, you talk about people talking about new coffee all the time. You can rebuild your sense of smell. It won't be the same as before, maybe, but you will still have a sense of smell that brings you pleasure and enjoyment and integration with the world.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, but new coffee tends to be for the disgusting.
Yeah, but new coffee will eventually adjust.
But it will come down, and you'll have pleasant new coffee or bearable new coffee as opposed to disgusting new coffee.
I'm afraid we've come to the end of the hour. I'm very sorry that we have so many unanswered questions, but please come again. In 2 weeks, I will have Professor Thomas Hummel with me. He is going to be speaking about a promising new treatment for people who have phantosmia. And Carol Yan from Stanford is going to be talking about another promising new treatment for people who've had COVID-related or, in fact, post-viral smell loss. So do please join us in 2 weeks. One of these days we'll get around to answering more questions, but for tonight, thank you very much, Simon, Jane, and Aidan, and we'll see the rest of you in 2 weeks. Good night.
Thank you.
Everybody.
See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.